I knew my career was about to get set on fire when my phone buzzed at 4:52 on a Friday afternoon. And not the good kind of buzz. Not the happy hour starts now buzz. This was the buzz of a landmine. You know the sound. That cheerful little chime that usually means someone's asking if there's oat milk left in the break room fridge. Except this time, it was a message that had been sent to the wrong person by the second dumbest man in my office, and it was about to blow up the first dumbest man's entire plan. I'm Margot Calloway. I'm 46 years old. I run risk and fraud prevention at a fintech company called Halcyon Pay, and I have been here for 14 years. Which in tech company years is basically a geological era. I joined when this place was 12 people crammed into a converted garage in East Austin, living on gas station burritos and the delusional belief that we were going to change how small businesses get paid. Now we're 400 employees, a glass building downtown with a lobby that looks like an Apple store had a baby with a dentist's waiting room, and a leadership team that thinks synergy is a personality trait. I am not the fun one. I have never been the fun one. I am the one who tells the sales team they cannot promise a client in Dubai a feature that violates 3 separate federal regulations. I am the one who makes engineering document their code changes instead of just yeeting things into production and hoping. I am, in the language of the 28-year-olds who now outnumber me 4-1, kind of a lot. I prefer to think of myself as the load-bearing wall in a building full of people who keep trying to knock down walls because they read a blog post about open floor plans. So when my phone buzzed at 4:52 p.m., I looked down, expecting nothing more exciting than a calendar reminder. What I got instead was a message forwarded to me by accident from Dex Halloran, our 26-year-old head of vibes. Yes, that is an actual title on an actual business card that a grown adult handed me with a straight face, who apparently cannot work a group chat to save his life. He'd meant to send it to Preston Voss, our VP of Culture and Growth. Instead, he sent it to me. Directly to me. With my full name in the recipient field, like the universe wanted me to see it. The message said, "Yo, Preston, Dex locked and loaded for Friday. Streamlining Legacy Overhead. LOL. Love that title. So professional, so HR-proof." We frame the whole Q3 miss on her desk. Diane's going to be in the room for the toast, right? This is the move. She finds out live in front of everyone, and by the time she figures out what hit her, we're already popping champagne. R.I.P. Dinosaur. I sat there and read it 4 times. My stomach did the thing where it feels like you swallowed a bag of ice cubes whole. Dinosaur. Cute. Original. I've been called worse by better people. And honestly, this exact playbook has been run against me before, almost note for note, which should tell you something about how predictable men who think they're the first person to ever think of it actually are. Let me tell you about the last one, quickly because it's relevant, and because I think it'll explain why my hands weren't shaking by the time I got to the second paragraph of Dex's message. About 6 years ago, we had a VP of operations named Greg Pruitt, a man who wore cowboy boots with suits, unironically, and who spent an entire quarter quietly building a narrative that I was, in his words at a leadership offsite I wasn't invited to but heard about from someone who was, resistant to change in a way that's honestly starting to hold the whole department back. Greg's version of the plan wasn't nearly as sophisticated as Preston's. No slide deck, no forged signatures, just a slow, patient campaign of being left out of meetings, having my recommendations quietly overruled and then blamed when the overruled decision predictably went wrong. and one truly memorable performance review where he told me, with a completely straight face, that my energy in meetings was something I should work on. A note so vague and so obviously manufactured that even HR at the time, a considerably less competent HR department than the one we have now, raised an eyebrow at it. What Greg didn't know, because this was years before the Sentinel even existed as an idea, was that I still kept my own paper trail, old school, meticulous, every email, every meeting note, every instance of a decision I'd flagged as risky going unheeded and then quietly blowing up exactly the way I'd warned it would. When Greg finally moved to fire me for cultural misalignment, another phrase I would like permanently retired from the English language, I walked into that meeting with 18 months of documented, dated, time-stamped evidence that every single major operational failure that quarter traced directly back to a decision he'd made against my explicit written recommendation. He didn't get to fire me. He got, instead, a very quiet, very awkward conversation with the board about his own performance. And within 4 months, he'd decided to pursue new opportunities, which is corporate for what actually happened, which is that the board decided for him. Last I heard, and I want to be clear, I did not go looking for this information. It found me entirely by accident, through a mutual former coworker. He now manages a car detailing shop off I-35 in San Marcos, which I choose to believe is a genuinely fine and respectable way to spend a life, and which I think about with an entirely disproportionate amount of satisfaction, roughly once a month, usually while I'm sitting in traffic on that exact stretch of highway. Karma, in my experience, has a very specific sense of humor around this particular office, and apparently it likes recurring characters. Preston, in other words, was not the first man to underestimate the load-bearing wall. He was just the one dumb enough to also try forging her signature. I clicked the attached file, which I should not have had access to, except Preston is the kind of executive who sets every single document to anyone with the link, because remembering to add 3 specific email addresses is, in his mind, a form of oppression. The deck was titled, in a font I can only describe as aggressively confident, Streamlining Legacy Overhead, A Path Forward for Q4. It was beautiful in the way a car crash is beautiful if you're standing far enough away. There were charts. There were red arrows pointing down next to my department's name. There was a fabricated timeline claiming I had personally blocked 3 critical product updates in November, tanking our Q3 numbers, while simultaneously rubber stamping approvals for legacy favorites. Whatever that meant. I don't have favorites. I have people who fill out their compliance training on time and people who don't. There was a slide literally titled, Time for New Blood, with a stock photo of a phoenix on it. A phoenix. In a fintech deck. About me. I wanted to laugh and throw up at the same time, which is a very specific and very corporate kind of nausea. And the timing. The timing was the part that really got me. This wasn't a quiet performance improvement plan conversation in a closed-door office with HR taking notes. This was scheduled to be presented live at our company holiday gala next Friday night at a downtown hotel ballroom we were renting for $40,000 because apparently team morale this year required a chocolate fountain and a live saxophonist. And in the room, front and center, was going to be Diane Okafor, our incoming chief financial officer, a woman with a reputation so fearsome that the finance team had started referring to budget season as Diane season, the way you'd refer to hurricane season. They weren't just trying to get me fired. Firing someone is a Tuesday afternoon conversation with HR and a box for your desk plants. What they were planning was a public execution. in front of the one person whose first impression of me would define whether I had a career left in this industry at all. They wanted my professional reputation to die in a ballroom with a chocolate fountain running in the background. And then they wanted to use my corpse as a stepping stone. The deck's final slide, I want you to know, was a proposed new org chart. Preston's box had moved up. It said, VP of Culture, Growth, and Risk. My entire department folded into his empire like a hostile annexation with a LinkedIn announcement. I sat there in my office, glass walls on two sides, because apparently transparency is also a personality trait around here, and I watched the floor start to empty out for the weekend. Preston was over by the elevators, doing that thing men in tight vests do where they mime a golf swing to punctuate a joke nobody actually laughed at. Dex was next to him, checking his smartwatch every 4 seconds like it was going to tell him something more interesting than the time. And next to both of them was Chelsea Cole, our senior manager of people experience, who I am fairly sure has never used the word fired once in her professional life, preferring instead phrases like transitioning out of the org and right-sizing the team's energy. They looked so happy, so relaxed, like 3 raccoons who'd found an unlocked dumpster and had absolutely no idea the dumpster was actually a bear trap with a law degree. I did not scream. I did not march out there and throw my stapler at Preston's very expensive, very unnecessary haircut, although I want full credit for the restraint that took. I took a sip of coffee that had gone cold approximately 2 hours earlier and had the general consistency and flavor profile of a swamp, and I felt something settle over me that I can only describe as a very focused, very quiet kind of calm. This is usually the part of the story where the woman starts crying, calls her sister, maybe pours a glass of wine and doubts herself for 6 hours. Respectfully, not me. I learned a long time ago that in corporate America, tears are just lubricant for a machine that is actively trying to eat you. By the way, and I promise this is the only time I'll break the fourth wall like this, but if you're the kind of person who enjoys watching a corporate disaster unfold in real time, you might as well get comfortable, because this one gets significantly worse before it gets better. Stick around. I promise you, it's worth it. I downloaded the deck. I screenshotted the Slack message before Dex could realize his mistake and delete it, which, spoiler, he never even noticed. I checked the file's metadata to confirm it had been built during company hours, which meant Preston had spent a not insignificant chunk of his Tuesday building a hit piece on me, instead of doing the compliance module I'd assigned him 3 weeks earlier about, ironically, appropriate use of company resources. Here's the thing they forgot. The one small, glowing, absolutely fatal detail. They were trying to build a case that I had been abusing my access, mishandling approvals, quietly sabotaging the department out of some kind of dinosaur spite. That's rich. That's like accusing a fish of loitering in the ocean. I didn't just work in the system. I built large parts of the system. I wrote the access control architecture. I designed the logging pipeline that tracks every permission change, every login, every file touch, down to the timestamp and the device fingerprint. If Preston Voss so much as sneezed near a production server, there was a record of it somewhere, with my fingerprints all over the code that captured it. They thought they were writing a hit piece on me. What they were actually doing, without knowing it, was signing a confession in triplicate. Before I go any further, let me back up for a second, because I know some of you like context, and honestly, I like giving it, because the context is half the fun. Halcyon Pay started in 2011 as a way for tiny mom-and-pop businesses to accept card payments without paying the same absurd fees the big processors charge. And for the first 3 years, it was genuinely, unglamorously good. We built something people needed. I joined in year 2, straight out of a compliance job at a regional bank that had bored me half to death, because the founder, a soft-spoken engineer named Walt, who has since been eased out into an advisory role that nobody has ever seen him actually advise anything from, promised me I'd get to build the risk function from scratch, instead of just enforcing someone else's outdated rulebook. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. For the first 6 years, this place felt like a family. If your family also occasionally forgot to pay payroll on time and communicated primarily through all-caps Slack messages. Then we raised a Series B, then a Series C. And somewhere in there, the family started filling up with strangers who talked about disruption, unironically, and thought a 45-minute stand-up meeting was an efficient use of anyone's time. I watched 3 different VPs of growth come and go in 5 years, each one younger, each one more confident, each one absolutely certain that the compliance department existed purely to slow down their brilliant ideas, rather than to keep the entire company out of a federal courtroom. Preston Voss was the 4th. He arrived 8 months before all of this happened, trailing a LinkedIn post about radical velocity that got 4,000 likes and made every single risk professional who read it wince in unison. He had never worked in fintech before Halcyon. He had, according to his own bio, scaled culture at 2 companies that no longer exist, which in this industry is less of a red flag and more of a full marching band playing a funeral dirge directly at you. I want to introduce one more person here because she matters, and because, frankly, this story would have gone very differently without her. Priya Anand, our Associate General Counsel, 39 years old, the only other person on that floor who has ever once used the phrase material misrepresentation correctly in casual conversation, and my closest thing to a work best friend, if 2 women who mostly bond over shared contempt for open floor plans and bad coffee can be called that. Priya has an office 2 doors down from mine, a framed photo of her golden retriever on her desk, and absolutely zero tolerance for corporate nonsense dressed up as innovation. When I forwarded her the screenshot of Dex's Slack message that Friday evening, before I'd even finished digging through the logs, her response came back in under 90 seconds. Priya. Oh, they did not. Priya. Send me the deck right now. I am opening a bottle of wine, and I have not even seen it yet. That's how confident I am that I'm going to need it. I sent her the deck. I sent her the timestamp discrepancy the moment I found it. Over that first weekend, Priya became my entire war room, my sanity check, my one outside pair of eyes, making sure that what I was building was airtight enough to survive contact with actual lawyers, not just satisfying enough to survive contact with my own anger. She's the one who told me, calmly, over the phone on Saturday morning while I paced my kitchen in pajamas, that everything I'd found so far was solid but circumstantial. That I needed something that tied Preston's physical presence to the fabricated approval, something a defense attorney couldn't wave away as an unfortunate coincidence of timestamps. She's the one, in other words, who sent me back to the Sentinel logs to look specifically for device proximity data, 3 days before I would have stumbled onto it myself out of sheer stubbornness. You're not just building a case to save your job, she told me that Saturday, her voice going quiet and serious in a way it rarely did. If they're willing to forge your signature and spoof a production approval to frame you, Margot, that's not workplace politics anymore. That's fraud. And it's the kind of fraud that usually isn't happening in isolation. People who are willing to go that far to protect a narrative are almost always protecting something bigger than the narrative. I didn't fully understand how right she was until Thursday, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It was 5:04 p.m. on that first Friday. The elevator doors closed on the 3 of them, off to whatever overpriced happy hour they were headed to, probably to toast in advance to a victory they hadn't earned yet. I was alone on the floor. The air conditioning hummed above me, low and steady, and for the first time all day, it sounded less like white noise and more like something almost supportive, like the building itself was rooting for me. "Okay," I said out loud, to nobody, because talking to an empty office is a completely normal and sane thing to do when you're about to go to war. "You want a show? I'll give you a show." I opened a terminal window. Black background, blinking green cursor. The one honest thing in that entire building. It doesn't flatter you. It doesn't gaslight you. It doesn't tell you your feedback is so valued right before it stabs you in the back at a company gala. It just executes. I typed in my credentials. They wanted to expose my history. Fine. Turnabout is more than fair play. It's practically a public service. But before they got to expose anything about me, I was going to take a very long, very thorough look at theirs. And unlike them, I wasn't going to need to fabricate a single slide. The truth, sitting quietly inside a corporate server, is always uglier and more entertaining than anything a 26-year-old with a Head of Vibes title could dream up on a Tuesday afternoon. I leaned back in my chair. The cheap ergonomic mesh dug into my spine the way it always does, a permanent reminder that our office furniture budget went to that chocolate fountain instead. A smile spread across my face, the kind that pulls a little at muscles you don't usually use. The kind that means you've stopped being prey and started being something else entirely. This wasn't about saving my job anymore. My job, frankly, was the least interesting thing on the table now. This was about consequences, finally catching up to people who'd never once had to face them. And I was about to become the consequence. I spent that entire weekend doing something I don't think I'd done in 14 years at that company. I actually let myself be scared for about 2 hours on Saturday afternoon, in the specific, honest way you can only be scared when nobody's watching. I sat on my kitchen floor with Gerald, who has very little patience for emotional crises unless they involve dropped food, and I let myself think through the absolute worst-case version of this. What if the logs weren't enough? What if Preston had a version of events prepared, some plausible story about a shared login or a delegated approval, something a sympathetic HR director could be talked into believing over the word of a woman 4 different men in a row had privately nicknamed a dinosaur? What if Diane Okafor walked into that gala already primed to see me exactly the way the slide deck wanted her to? An obstacle, a cost center, a name on a spreadsheet to be optimized away in her first 90 days. I let myself sit in that for 2 hours. Then I got up, made a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint, and called Priya. "Talk me through it again," she said. And I could hear her own kitchen in the background, a dog's nails clicking on tile, the domestic soundtrack of a woman who was giving up her entire Saturday to help me build a case against 3 coworkers and, as it would turn out, a security flaw none of us knew about yet. Every piece, slowly, like I'm a jury. So I did. I walked her through the spoofed timestamp, the Bluetooth handshake, the mismatched pixelation on the forged signature, the hidden folder, the shell company registration, the invoices. She stopped me twice to ask sharp, precise questions. How do you know the handshake data wasn't itself spoofed? Is the chain of custody on these exports going to hold up if this becomes a legal matter? Have you touched a single one of these files in a way that could be construed as tampering? I answered every one. By the time I finished, it was nearly 5 in the evening, and her voice on the other end had gone quiet in that particular way lawyers' voices go quiet right before they tell you something you don't want to hear. "This is good, Margot. This is genuinely good. But I want you to hear me on something, because I've read enough of these internal fraud cases to have a pattern recognition problem about it." She paused. $50-something thousand routed through a sibling's shell company is a real crime, and it's absolutely enough to end Preston's career and probably get him charged. But it is not, on its own, the kind of thing that makes a grown man risk forging a compliance officer's electronic signature and spoofing a production system approval. That's an enormous amount of risk for a relatively small payout. People take risks that size to protect something with a lot more on the line than 50 grand. I'd keep digging somewhere you haven't looked yet before Friday. I don't know where, but somewhere. I didn't sleep particularly well that night, and it had nothing to do with the coffee. Sunday, I mostly spent rereading the same set of logs until the numbers stopped looking like numbers, and taking Gerald to the vet for his quarterly checkup, where the vet tech asked if everything was okay because apparently I looked, in her exact words, like a woman planning a heist. Which, fair, accurate, no notes. Sunday afternoon, my sister Carol called, completely unaware of anything happening, wanting to talk about Thanksgiving plans and whether I was bringing the good pie this year, meaning the bourbon pecan one I make exactly once annually and refuse to share the recipe for, even with her, especially with her, because she once tried to improve it with a splash of maple syrup, and I have never fully recovered from the betrayal. I let her talk for a good 10 minutes about her kids' school schedules and a mutual cousin's very complicated divorce, before she paused and asked, in the specific tone only a sister can use, "You're being weird. What's going on with you?" I thought about lying, the way I usually do when work gets messy. Some vague line about a difficult project, nothing worth worrying about. Instead, for reasons I still can't entirely explain, I told her almost the whole thing, sitting on my back porch with a mug of tea going cold, watching the neighbor's dog patrol the fence line like he had somewhere important to be. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, longer than Carol is ever quiet about anything. "Margot," she finally said, "you built a system that catches people lying, on your own time, for free, 8 months before you needed it, because some tiny part of you already knew this exact thing was coming for you eventually." A pause. "That's either the most impressive thing you've ever done, or the saddest. And I genuinely can't decide which, and I need you to know I mean that with a huge amount of love." "Can it be both?" I asked. "It can absolutely be both," she said. "I just want you to be careful. Not careful like don't do it. Careful like, this sounds like it's about to become a very big deal, bigger than a work thing. And I want you to have people around you while it happens, not just a spreadsheet and a diabetic cat." "I have Priya." "Priya's a lawyer, Margot. That's not the same as having a person." I could hear her smiling through the phone, the particular fondness of someone who has known you your entire life and loves you exactly as much for your flaws as in spite of them. "Call me the second it's over. I don't care what time it is. I want to hear every single detail. And I want to hear it from you, not secondhand from Mom, who will absolutely find out somehow and call me in a panic first." "Deal," I said, and meant it. And did, in fact, call her at 11:40 that Friday night, still buzzing, still in my green dress, and talked for 45 minutes straight while Gerald slept through the entire recounting, thoroughly unbothered, as he tends to be about literally everything except dinner time. By Sunday night, I had a plan for Monday morning that mostly amounted to keep digging, don't tip anyone off, act exactly like a boring compliance dinosaur who suspects absolutely nothing. It is, I will admit, one of the very few professional skills I have that I am genuinely proud of. My ability to look completely unbothered while internally I am assembling a case file with the focus of a woman defusing a bomb she built herself, out of spite, several months ago, without fully admitting to herself why. Monday morning rolled in with all the grace of a garbage truck reversing into a dumpster at 6 a.m. I walked into the office in my standard uniform, charcoal cardigan, sensible slacks, an expression that says, "I am thinking about spreadsheets. Please do not perceive me." This is a technique I call the gray rock method. If you are boring enough, predators lose interest and go looking for a more reactive target. They want drama. I gave them the ambient hum of a server fan and nothing else. The office had that particular manic holiday energy that makes me want to gargle bleach just to cleanse my soul a little. Someone had wrapped tinsel around every support pillar on the floor. Someone else had put a tiny Santa hat on our largest server rack, which is objectively very funny, and I refuse to admit that. And there, in the glass-walled conference room we all affectionately call the fishbowl, was the whole crew, huddled around a whiteboard, laughing about something. Preston, Dex, Chelsea, a couple of hangers-on from the growth team who exist mostly to agree with Preston in meetings. When I walked past, the laughter cut off mid-note, replaced by that specific performative hush people do when the subject of their gossip walks directly into the blast radius. Preston looked up and gave me a little finger wave, the kind that manages to be both condescending and slightly nervous at the same time, an impressive combination for a man wearing a vest 2 sizes too small. "Morning, Margot," he said, his voice pitching up at the end like he was asking a question he already knew the answer to. "Excited for the gala on Friday?" "Thrilled, Preston," I said, not breaking stride. "I'm mostly hoping the open bar has something strong enough to help me forget Q3 ever happened." He laughed, a dry, rattling sound like a stapler running out of staples. "That's the spirit. Hey, keep your calendar clear around 8, okay? We've got a little recognition segment planned. Want the whole team there for it." Recognition segment. In corporate speak, that phrase means public execution. The same way circling back means never, and we value your feedback means the opposite. Dex leaned around Preston's shoulder, grinning, holding up his phone like he was about to show me something delightful. "Yo, Margot, you catch the game this weekend?" I have never, in 14 years, watched a single minute of any sport Dex has ever referenced. He knows this. He asks anyway, every single Monday, purely as a kind of social filler noise, the verbal equivalent of elevator music. "Missed it," I said. "Busy weekend." "Ah, you gotta unplug more, that's the secret," he said, with the completely straight face of a man who had, according to my own login records, been awake at 2 in the morning the previous Tuesday, approving code changes he had no business touching. "Work-life balance, you know. Gotta protect your peace." "I'll take that under advisement," I said. And I meant it in a way none of them would understand for another 5 days. Chelsea materialized beside them with her clipboard, tilting her head at me with an expression of practiced warmth. "Margot! So glad you're here. I wanted to loop you in on the recognition segment run of show, just so nothing catches you off guard." She said this with absolutely no visible awareness of the irony, which remains, to this day, one of the more impressive feats of self-delusion I have personally witnessed in a professional setting. "It's going to be really special, a real moment for the team." "I bet it will be," I said, and smiled. The specific smile I'd been practicing in my bathroom mirror all weekend, the one that gives away absolutely nothing. "Wouldn't miss it," I said, dead-eyed, and kept walking to my desk. The second I sat down, I plugged in and got to work. While they spent the day picking fonts for what they thought was going to be my professional tombstone, I was performing what I can only describe as a full digital colonoscopy on their entire work history. People like Preston and Dex think of the cloud as some kind of magical, fluffy place where data just lives, unbothered, unowned. They do not understand that the cloud is just somebody else's computer, and right now, I had the keys to that computer. All of it. I started simple. System access logs. I wanted to see exactly when and how they'd touched the files they were claiming I had mishandled. What I found instead wasn't just incompetence. Incompetence I could have almost respected. What I found was sloppiness with a rot underneath it. Dex's login history was a disaster zone. He'd been accessing production files at 2 in the morning, more than once, supposedly from Starbucks Wi-Fi, a claim I found almost charmingly stupid, because I happen to know for a fact that no Starbucks in this city is open at 2 in the morning. A detail apparently nobody had bothered to check before deciding it was a plausible enough cover story to type into a Slack thread. The IP address didn't trace to any Starbucks I could find, obviously, because it wasn't one. I ran a basic geolocation lookup, cross-referenced it against our internal network map, and watched it resolve, cleanly, unambiguously, to a residential address in a luxury high-rise downtown, the kind of building with a rooftop pool and a doorman who almost certainly makes more thoughtful decisions than most of the people who live there. Dex lives with his parents in a suburb 45 minutes north and complains about that commute at least twice a week in the kitchen, loudly, to anyone who will listen, usually while making a smoothie in the shared blender nobody has ever seen him clean. So who exactly was logging in from a downtown apartment at 2 a.m. using his credentials? I cross-referenced the IP against our employee roster. Nothing. Then I ran it against our external vendor list. And there it was. A match. The billing address for a strategic consulting firm we'd onboarded 3 months earlier, called Cobalt Bridge Advisors, a vendor that, interestingly enough, Preston Voss himself had championed and pushed through onboarding in record time. So either Dex was letting a consulting firm use his login in the middle of the night, or someone at that firm had his credentials without his knowledge, logging in after hours to do things that presumably didn't need daylight and witnesses. I kept digging. The office smelled like burnt Keurig coffee and the faint ozone tang of overworked electronics. I put on noise-canceling headphones playing absolutely nothing, purely to block out Chelsea narrating her vision board 3 desks away, and I pulled up the change management logs, the closest thing our company has to Holy Scripture. Every code push, every permission escalation, every system change, time-stamped and attributed. Or at least, it's supposed to be. The deck claimed I had personally blocked a critical product update on November 11th, tanking a release and costing us the Q3 numbers. I pulled up November 11th. There was no block. There was, in fact, an approval, logged under my account. I stared at the timestamp. 3:17 a.m. I am 46 years old. I have a mortgage, a diabetic cat named Gerald who needs insulin on a strict schedule, and a bedtime that starts with the word 9. I am not awake at 3:17 in the morning approving code pushes. I have never once in 14 years approved anything at 3:17 in the morning. My blood went cold and then immediately hot. They hadn't just built a fake slide deck. They had used my actual account to forge actual evidence inside our actual production systems. Someone had spoofed my login to approve a code change that, according to the incident ticket, caused a 4-hour outage the next morning. An outage they were now blaming on legacy system instability. A phrase I am certain someone workshopped in a brainstorm session with a whiteboard and a marker that smelled like regret. They broke the system. They signed my name to the break, and they were about to present the fix as their own brilliant innovation in front of Diane Okafor while quietly pinning the wreckage on me. It was elegant, in the specific way only true sociopathy can be elegant. I looked up across the floor. Preston was leaning over Chelsea's monitor, pointing at something, both of them nodding along like completely normal coworkers collaborating on a completely normal Tuesday. That's the scariest part of corporate betrayal, by the way, in case nobody's told you yet. It's never dramatic. Nobody twirls a mustache. They wear $400 vests and drink oat milk lattes while quietly aiming for your aorta. A timestamp alone wasn't going to be enough. A timestamp is circumstantial. Maybe you were working late, Margot, they'd say. Maybe you forgot. I needed proof it wasn't me. And that's when I remembered the project I'd been quietly running in the background for the last 8 months. Off the books, unannounced, not even in the release notes. I called it the Sentinel. It wasn't official. It wasn't announced. It was a passion project I'd started building 8 months earlier, on a string of unremarkable Friday afternoons after most of the floor had already left for the weekend. And I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. It wasn't paranoia, exactly, though I understand how it looks from the outside. After the whole situation with Greg Pruitt years earlier, I'd promised myself that the next time someone tried to build a false narrative against me, I would never again have to rely on my own memory, my own inbox, my own carefully saved emails, all of which can be disputed, deleted, or dismissed as one person's word against another's. I wanted something that didn't have an opinion, something that simply recorded what actually happened, indifferent to who it happened to or who might be embarrassed by it. I started small, almost as a coding exercise, something to keep my hands busy during a genuinely boring stretch of a genuinely boring quarter. A background process, minimal footprint, logging things our standard audit system never bothered to capture. Not just who approved what, but the texture around it. Mouse movement patterns, typing cadence, which turns out to be almost as unique as a fingerprint once you have enough data points on a person. Device fingerprints tied to every login session, and almost as an afterthought, one Friday when I was bored and reading through Bluetooth protocol documentation for reasons I genuinely cannot fully reconstruct anymore, handshake data. If a phone or a smartwatch was within a few feet of a workstation when an action got taken, the Sentinel logged the handshake attempt, silently, quietly, forever, tucked into an encrypted table nobody but me even knew existed. I never told anyone I was building it, not even Priya, not at first. Partly because it wasn't officially sanctioned, and I didn't want to have the conversation about whether it needed to be. And partly, if I'm being fully honest with you, because some small, quiet part of me suspected that someday I might need it in exactly the way I ended up needing it. And I didn't want to have to explain that instinct out loud to anyone, including myself. It felt at the time like an overreaction, a smoke detector installed in a house that had never once caught fire. It is a genuinely strange feeling, watching a thing you built out of low-grade professional anxiety turn out to be the single most important piece of infrastructure standing between you and a public execution at a company holiday party. I don't fully recommend it as a coping mechanism. I also can't, in good conscience, tell you it didn't work. I hadn't checked its logs in weeks. It was a side project, something I tinkered with on slow Friday afternoons. Never something I expected to actually need. My hands weren't quite steady as I queried the database for November 11th. The terminal blinked. Data streamed down the screen, green text scrolling like something out of a movie, except uglier and infinitely more real. User, Margot Calloway, Admin. Action. Approve request number 4471. Timestamp 3/17/42. Device ID unrecognized. I froze. The device ID wasn't my laptop. It wasn't my desktop. It was a MAC address I didn't recognize at first glance, attached to a Bluetooth handshake from a device within 3 feet of that workstation at the exact moment the approval went through. An Apple Watch. Serial number partially visible in the log. I ran it against our internal device registration database, the one we maintain for company-issued hardware, mostly for insurance purposes. It matched Preston Voss's Apple Watch, the one he checks obsessively during every single meeting like it's about to deliver him a prophecy. I leaned back, and the leather of my chair creaked like an old door swinging open somewhere it shouldn't. Gotcha. They'd been so busy looking up, trying to drop an anvil on my head from a great height, that they never once thought to check the floor, where I'd quietly installed a trapdoor months ago without telling a single soul. Preston had logged in as me, probably using a password he'd gotten off a sticky note, or shoulder surfed while I was helping him troubleshoot his own email account back in October. An act of kindness I was now bitterly reconsidering. He'd used my identity to sabotage a production system, just so he could swoop in and fix it in front of leadership and look like the hero who saved the quarter, while quietly setting me up to take the fall for the outage he'd personally caused. The rage I felt at that moment wasn't hot. It wasn't the screaming, throw a stapler kind of rage. It was cold. Absolute zero. The kind of rage that is perfectly happy to wait because it already knows exactly how the story ends. I saved the logs. I encrypted the export. I copied the file to an encrypted drive on my keychain, the same keychain that has a rubber duck on it that my niece gave me for Christmas 3 years ago, because even domestic terrorism against your own executive team deserves a little whimsy. I looked up. Preston was walking toward the break room, whistling something that might have been a Christmas carol if you squinted with your ears. He caught my eye through the glass and flashed that same plastic, shark-like smile. "Working hard or hardly working, Margot?" he called out, delighted with himself. "Just tying up some loose ends, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly level, the voice of a woman who has never once dropped a scalpel mid-surgery. "Making sure everything's clean before the gala." "Love that. Team player," he said, and walked away, still whistling. I watched him go. He was walking directly into a wood chipper, whistling a Christmas carol the entire way, and he had absolutely no idea. There is a very specific kind of satisfaction in watching a man be that confident right before the floor opens up underneath him, and I am not going to pretend I didn't enjoy it. At least a little. Okay, more than a little. I enjoyed it the way some people enjoy a really good true crime podcast. Tuesday morning started with a detour I want to tell you about because it taught me something important. And also because I think you deserve to know that not every lead in a case like this actually goes anywhere. And it's important not to fall in love with the first suspicious thing you find. The first person I quietly, privately suspected of being Preston's actual accomplice wasn't Dex, and it wasn't Chelsea. It was a soft-spoken senior engineer named Marcus Odom, who had approved the code deploy immediately following the spoofed 3:17 a.m. login on November 11th. On paper, that made him look, for about 6 deeply uncomfortable hours, like he might have been in on the whole thing. I pulled his badge access logs. I pulled his calendar. I even, God forbid me, sat 2 cubicles away from him for an entire lunch hour on Tuesday, nursing a burrito I didn't want, just watching how he interacted with Preston in the hallway, which turned out to be exactly the same distant, slightly wary politeness he used with everyone in leadership. By 2 p.m., I had my answer, and it was almost disappointingly boring. Marcus had simply been the on-call engineer that night, half asleep, approving what looked like a routine, properly authorized deploy from an account that was, as far as the standard system could tell, mine. He had no idea. He'd gone back to bed. He found out about the outage the next morning the same way everyone else did, over coffee, complaining about it like a normal person whose only crime was trusting the badge on the login screen. I felt genuinely bad putting him under even that much scrutiny. And I want to be honest about that, because this whole story can sound, told the way I'm telling it, like some kind of triumphant, unbroken march toward the truth. And it wasn't. Some of it was messy. Some of it was chasing shadows down hallways that led nowhere. Some of it was sitting in a break room at 2 p.m. pretending to read a burrito wrapper, quietly ruling out a completely innocent man so I could stop wasting energy on him and get back to the people who actually deserved it. Priya, when I told her about Marcus that evening, laughed for a solid 10 seconds before she managed to say, "Congratulations, you've just invented the compliance version of a red herring. Please never tell HR you surveilled a man over a burrito." Which, fair. And also, I stand by it. Because ruling someone out with actual evidence is still due diligence, even when it feels a little ridiculous in hindsight. The office had been fully weaponized with festivity by this point. Garlands shedding little plastic pine needles into everyone's keyboards, a Mariah Carey playlist on loop that I am fairly sure at some point violates a treaty somewhere. Chelsea had taken to walking the floor with a clipboard, literally an actual clipboard, collecting RSVPs for the gala's seating chart with the intensity of a woman planning a small European wedding. She stopped by my desk Tuesday afternoon, all bright teeth and buzzwords. "Margot, so excited to celebrate everyone's contributions this year," she said, in the specific tone people use when they are lying to your face while genuinely believing they are being kind. "I put you at table 6, great sightline to the stage." "Can't wait," I said, and meant it, in a way she had absolutely no way of understanding yet. "You've seemed a little quiet this week," she added, tilting her head, and for one unnerving second I wondered if she suspected anything at all, before she finished the sentence with, "Let me know if you want to talk about, the Q3 stuff. No judgment. We're all human." And there it was, the practiced HR buzzword compassion of a woman rehearsing her lines for a performance she thought was still a week away. "I appreciate that, Chelsea," I said, and went back to my monitor, where a terminal window she couldn't see was quietly pulling 3 months of her own calendar invites, cross-referenced against Preston's, looking for patterns neither of them knew I'd ever think to look for. While the little assassination committee spent their days printing full-color handouts and rehearsing their recognition segment in a conference room with the blinds drawn, I was deep in the digital sewer, wading through the sludge of their incompetence. And let me tell you, it got so much worse than I expected. The spoofed login on November 11th was just the tip of it. That was the visible part, the part meant to sink me publicly. Underneath the waterline was something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with several people quietly stealing from a company that trusted them. I found a hidden folder on the shared drive, and when I say hidden, I mean someone had literally just right-clicked and checked the hidden box in Windows, which is the digital equivalent of throwing a beach towel over an elephant and assuming nobody will notice the elephant. I only found it because the Sentinel's file access index doesn't actually care whether Windows Explorer wants to show you something or not. It logs every file that exists on a monitored drive, hidden attribute or otherwise, which meant that, somewhere around 11:40 on Wednesday night, 3 energy drinks deep and running purely on spite, I was scrolling through an alphabetized list of every file Preston Voss had touched in the last 90 days when I found one labeled, with a subtlety that honestly insulted my intelligence a little, ZZ underscore do not open. I want you to sit with that folder name for a second, because I certainly did. A man who had gone to the trouble of forging a compliance officer's electronic signature, pixel by pixel, in a PDF editor, had named his incriminating evidence folder ZZ underscore do not open, which is roughly the security equivalent of hiding your diary under your mattress with a sign on top that says, "Definitely not a diary." Inside was a cache of backdated compliance documents, more than a dozen of them, all related to our vendor onboarding process. Here's the boring but important part, and I promise it matters. In fintech, before you can bring on any outside vendor who touches customer data, they have to pass a 40-point security and compliance review. It takes weeks. It is a genuine pain in everyone's neck. I'm the one who enforces it, which is roughly 70% of the reason people around here call me the dinosaur behind my back and think I don't know about it. Cobalt Bridge Advisors, the mysterious consulting firm with the downtown apartment and the 2 a.m. login habit, had never actually passed that review. Preston hadn't just skipped it, he'd forged it. He'd taken an old, legitimate compliance form from a different vendor, run it through a PDF editor, swapped out the logo, and slapped Cobalt Bridge's name across the top like he was doing arts and crafts. And here's the part that made me laugh out loud, alone, in my glass-walled office, loud enough that someone 2 desks over glanced up. He'd copy-pasted my electronic signature onto the bottom of the form, but he'd been lazy about it. The pixelation on my signature was a completely different resolution than the rest of the scanned document, like a ransom note assembled out of pixels instead of magazine letters. Wednesday afternoon gave me the closest call of the entire week, and I still think about it sometimes, how differently everything could have gone if I'd been 30 seconds slower closing a browser tab. I was elbow deep in the forged compliance PDF, comparing pixel resolutions side by side on my second monitor, when Preston appeared in my office doorway, unannounced, the way he always did, treating every closed door in that building as more of a suggestion than a boundary. "Hey, got a sec?" he said, already stepping inside before I'd answered, which was very on brand for him. I closed the laptop lid halfway, not all the way, because slamming a laptop shut in front of someone is the single most suspicious thing a person can do. And I have spent 14 years training myself out of suspicious body language, the way other people train themselves out of a smoking habit. "Sure," I said, turning my chair slightly, putting my body between him and the screen without making it look deliberate. "What's up?" "So, quick thing, for the deck Friday." He said it so casually, so breezily, that for one truly unsettling second, I genuinely thought he was about to confess, that some part of him wanted to be caught, wanted someone to stop this before it went any further. That is not, it turns out, what was happening. We're doing a little year-in-review thing, recognizing different departments, and I wanted to ask, off the record, just between us, is there anything from your team's Q3 work you'd actually want highlighted? I want to make sure it's, balanced, fair. I looked at him for a long moment. This man, standing in my office, asking me, with what appeared to be genuine sincerity, to help him pick which parts of my own department's work he should include in the presentation that was, at that exact moment, sitting open on my screen with a slide titled "Time for New Blood" and a stock photo of a phoenix. There is a very specific kind of vertigo that comes with realizing someone is capable of looking you directly in the eye and lying with that much comfort, that much practiced ease, like it costs him nothing at all. "You know what, Preston?" I said, keeping my voice level, pleasant, boring, the exact tone of a woman who suspects absolutely nothing. "I trust your judgment on it. You clearly know exactly what story you want to tell." He grinned, delighted, completely missing the second meaning sitting right there in plain sight. "Love that. Team player." He knocked twice on my doorframe, like he was signing off a phone call, and left. I sat there for a full minute after he'd gone, hands flat on my desk, breathing the way you breathe after a near accident on the highway. That specific adrenaline crash that arrives a beat too late to actually be useful. Then, I reopened my laptop, pulled the pixelated signature back up on screen, and got back to work. Because there was no version of that week where stopping was an option. I followed the money next, because with people like this, the money always tells the real story. I pulled the procurement logs. Yes, I have read access there too. I helped build that database back in 2013, before Preston Voss had even finished his undergrad marketing degree. Cobalt Bridge Advisors had been billing Halcyon Pay $18,000 a month for 3 months running. The invoices themselves were almost insultingly vague. Strategic alignment services, growth optimization consulting, cross-functional synergy support. Nothing. Absolutely nothing you could point to and say, "This is a deliverable. This is a thing that exists in the world." I dug into the corporate registration records for Cobalt Bridge Advisors, which took exactly 11 minutes of public database searching because whoever set it up hadn't bothered to hide it particularly well. The registered agent was a woman named Renata Voss, Preston's sister. There it was. Not just workplace cruelty, not just a petty office coup dressed up in a PowerPoint deck. This was a man quietly siphoning $54,000 and counting out of the company through a fake consulting arrangement run by his own sibling, using forged compliance paperwork with my forged signature on it, and now trying to publicly destroy the one person whose job it literally was to catch exactly this kind of thing before it became a problem for the board. I sat back in my chair and let that sink in for a minute. My tea had gone cold. The Mariah Carey playlist had somehow found an even more aggressive holiday song to loop, and somewhere, across the floor, Chelsea Cole was laughing at something on her phone, blissfully unaware that she was 3 days away from being on the wrong side of what I was already starting to think of as an audit event. By Wednesday afternoon, I had enough documentation to sink Preston Voss on the shell company alone. A tidy little fraud case, forgery, misappropriation of funds, the whole package, wrapped up with a bow for HR and legal to open on Monday. It would have been enough. It would have been, frankly, satisfying. But something kept nagging at me. $18,000 a month is a lot of money to most people. But in the context of a Series C fintech company with a 9-figure valuation, it's a rounding error. It's not the kind of number that keeps a VP of culture and growth up at night, sweating. It's the kind of number you could explain away with a decent lawyer and an apologetic press statement. It wasn't enough motive, on its own, for the sheer scale of what they were trying to do to me. Framing someone, forging their signature, spoofing their login credentials to cause a real production outage — that's not the behavior of a guy trying to cover up 50 grand of petty grift. That's the behavior of a guy who is scared. Genuinely, deeply scared of something much bigger being found. I didn't know it yet, sitting there Wednesday afternoon with cold tea and a stack of digital evidence I thought was already the whole story. But I was about to find out that the shell company wasn't the crime. The shell company was just the receipt. Thursday morning, one day before the gala, I almost let it go. I had enough. My lawyer brain, the part of me trained by 14 years of compliance work to know when a case is airtight, told me I had what I needed. Wrap it up, send it to legal. Go to the gala, watch the fireworks, collect my apology, move on with my life. But there was a line item in the Cobalt Bridge invoices that kept snagging on something in the back of my mind, like a loose thread you can feel with your finger but can't quite see. One of the invoices, back in October, listed a deliverable as Q4 Security Review, Remediation Consulting, Payments API. Cobalt Bridge Advisors was a marketing consulting shell company run by a woman who, according to her own sparse LinkedIn profile, had spent the last 6 years doing wedding photography in Waco. She was not, by any reasonable definition, qualified to review anything involving a payments API. So why was an invoice from a fake marketing firm referencing a security review of our actual payment processing system, the single most sensitive piece of infrastructure this entire company runs on? I pulled up our internal ticketing system and searched Payments API plus security for the last quarter. Most of what came back was routine, boring, the kind of thing that makes engineers happy and compliance officers happier. But there was one ticket, filed in September, then closed 2 days later with the resolution note, false positive, no action needed, that made the hair on my arms stand up. It had been filed by an automated vulnerability scanner. It flagged an authentication bypass in a legacy endpoint of our payments API, the kind of flaw that, in the wrong hands, could let someone impersonate a merchant account and quietly reroute transaction settlements. It wasn't a small bug. It was the kind of bug that ends up as a headline, the kind that ends up as a class action lawsuit, the kind that ends up with a company's name trending for reasons that have nothing to do with a chocolate fountain. 2 days, flagged and closed in 2 days, marked false positive by an account belonging to our chief technology officer, named Arthur Byrne, who I genuinely liked, who brought his dog to the office on Fridays, and who I had never once suspected of anything worse than being a little too attached to a specific brand of standing desk. I want to tell you a little about Arthur, because it matters, and because I think it's important you understand this wasn't some cartoon villain I'd been quietly hating for months. Arthur had been at Halcyon almost as long as I had, hired the same year, one of the original dozen people crammed into that garage in East Austin. He was the kind of engineer who still personally reviewed critical pull requests, even after he'd been promoted well past the point where anyone would have expected it of him. Who remembered the names of everyone's kids, who had once, memorably, spent an entire Saturday helping me debug a personal project completely unrelated to work, purely because I'd mentioned being stuck on it during a Tuesday stand-up. He was not, by any definition I would have used a week earlier, a man capable of quietly burying a critical security flaw to protect a funding round. That was, I think, the single most unsettling part of the entire discovery. Not the vulnerability itself, not even the size of it, but the specific, personal betrayal of realizing that a man I'd trusted for 13 years had decided, at some point, that a 9-figure valuation was worth more than the actual safety of the actual small businesses whose payroll we processed every single week. People don't usually turn into that overnight. Something pressures them into it, slowly, a little at a time, until the version of themselves that would have refused is simply gone, replaced by a version that tells himself it's temporary, that it's just this once, that he'll fix it quietly later, when nobody's watching the clock as closely. I don't know, even now, exactly what pressure got applied to Arthur, or by whom. I have my suspicions. I'll get to those. I sat very still for a moment. The office around me had gone quiet in that particular pre-holiday party way. Half the floor already checked out mentally, if not physically. Decorations rustling faintly under the air vents. I thought about the timeline. A real vulnerability, flagged by an automated system in September. Closed as a false positive within 48 hours by the CTO. And the following month, a shell company run by the VP of Culture's sister starts billing $18,000 for vague security review services on the exact system where the vulnerability lived. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a cover-up, and it was being funded through the same fraudulent vendor relationship that had also apparently been designed to frame me the moment anyone got too close to noticing it. I pulled the actual scan report attached to that ticket, buried 3 folders deep where nobody would casually stumble across it. The vulnerability had a severity score that would make any real security team break out in a cold sweat. And attached to the ticket, in an internal comment thread that I don't think anyone expected a compliance officer to ever have reason to read, was a short exchange between Arthur Byrne and Preston Voss. This needs to go to legal, and probably to the board before the funding round closes. If this leaks during due diligence, we're finished. Kill the ticket. I'll handle optics. We patch it quietly next quarter after the round closes. Nobody outside this thread needs to know it existed. If Margot's compliance team gets wind of this before the Series D signs, she'll blow the whole thing up on principle and we lose the round. You know how she is. I read that last line about 4 times. You know how she is. As if doing my actual job, the job I was hired and specifically paid to do, was some kind of personality flaw, some inconvenient character trait to be managed around, rather than a function of the entire reason a compliance department exists in the first place. As if protecting our customers' money from a known, documented authentication bypass was an act of corporate disloyalty, rather than the single most basic obligation we had to every small business owner who trusted us with their payroll and their rent money. I thought, sitting there, about a woman named Denise Fournier, who runs a small bakery in Round Rock and has been a Halcyon customer for 6 years. I know her name because she called our support line personally, once, years ago, to thank a junior analyst on my team for catching a fraudulent chargeback dispute that would have wiped out nearly a month of her margins, and the story had made its way around the office as a small, quiet reminder of why any of this actually mattered. I thought about her, and about the hundreds of small business owners just like her, entirely unaware that a documented authentication bypass had been sitting live in our payments infrastructure for 4 months, entirely unaware that 2 men with much nicer offices than mine had looked directly at that risk and decided it was worth leaving open a little longer, purely so a valuation number could stay exactly where they wanted it. That, more than the forged signature, more than the fabricated timeline, more than even the planned public humiliation at the gala, was the moment the whole thing stopped being personal and became something considerably larger than my own bruised ego. It clicked into place all at once, cold and total, like a walk-in freezer door sealing shut. The slide deck. The public humiliation planned for the gala. The timing of all of it, 1 week before Halcyon's Series D funding round was set to close, with new capital, a new valuation, and a mandatory security and compliance due diligence review from the incoming investors team. A review that would absolutely, unquestionably surface a live, unpatched authentication bypass in our payments infrastructure if anyone competent got a real look at our systems. They weren't trying to get rid of me because I was a bottleneck for Q3. They were trying to get rid of me before the due diligence review because I was the one person at this company both qualified and stubborn enough to find exactly what I had just found and blow up a 9-figure funding round rather than let it slide. Getting me publicly discredited and pushed out wasn't corporate cruelty for its own sake. It was strategic. It was a scheduled demolition, timed to the week, designed to remove the load-bearing wall right before the inspector showed up. I felt something shift in my chest, and it wasn't fear, though there was some of that in there too, somewhere underneath. It was clarity. This had stopped being a story about a woman fighting to keep her job. This was now a story about whether a couple hundred small business owners who trusted Halcyon Pay with their payroll accounts were going to keep getting quietly exposed to a known security hole because 2 men wanted a bigger bonus and a cleaner cap table. That is not a fight I was going to lose. Not because I'm particularly brave. I want to be honest with you. I'm not. I am, if anything, extremely risk-averse, which is sort of the entire premise of my job. But there is a very specific kind of anger that shows up when you realize the people trying to destroy your reputation are also, quietly, actively endangering the exact people your job exists to protect. That anger does not shake. It does not doubt itself. It gets extremely, terrifyingly organized. I spent Thursday afternoon and most of Thursday evening building something I'd never actually had a real occasion to use before. A compiled, encrypted, board and legal ready evidence package containing the spoofed login logs with the Bluetooth handshake data tying Preston to my faked approval, the forged compliance documents with the mismatched pixelation on my copy-pasted signature, the shell company registration records naming his sister, the procurement invoices, and, at the center of it all like a still beating heart, the vulnerability scan report and the internal comment thread between Preston Voss and Arthur Byrne discussing, in writing, on company servers, their decision to conceal a known security flaw from their own investors ahead of a funding round. I did not send it yet. I wanted, for reasons that were maybe 70% strategic and 30% deeply unprofessionally petty, for them to actually stand up in that ballroom and try it. I wanted them on the record, in front of witnesses, attempting the exact thing they'd planned. I wanted Diane Okafor sitting in that room when it happened, not because I needed a savior, but because I needed a witness whose word the board would trust without question and whose reputation for ruthlessness would work, for once, entirely in my favor. I called Priya the second I'd finished compiling the package. It was almost 9 at night by then, and I could hear from the background noise that I'd caught her mid-dinner. But the second I said the words, authentication bypass, and closed as false positive by the CTO, I heard a fork actually clatter against a plate. "Say that again?" she said, all traces of casual Thursday evening warmth gone from her voice, replaced by something flat and focused that I'd only heard from her twice before, both times in actual depositions. I read her the ticket. I read her the comment thread between Byrne and Voss, word for word, twice, while she made me repeat the exact phrasing of "kill the ticket, I'll handle optics," a third time, presumably committing it to memory the way I imagine she commits statutes to memory, effortlessly and a little frighteningly. "Margot," she said my name the way you'd say it to someone standing too close to the edge of something. "Do you understand what you're actually holding right now? This isn't an HR matter anymore. This isn't even really a fraud matter, not primarily. If a known, exploitable vulnerability in a payment system was deliberately concealed from investors ahead of a funding round, and the CEO signed off on security representations in that term sheet without disclosing it, you are looking at a potential securities issue. That's a different regulatory universe. That's the kind of thing that ends up with the SEC's name in a headline next to ours. I know, I said. And I did know, in the abstract, professional, thoroughly trained for exactly this scenario way. It was different hearing her say it out loud, in her kitchen, over what I assume was a very good dinner going cold. Okay. I heard her take a breath, the specific, controlled breath of a lawyer deciding how to advise a friend without accidentally advising a client. You have to send this to outside counsel the second it's confirmed, not just to me. I can't be your only legal sounding board on something this size. It's not fair to either of us. And frankly, it's not defensible procedure if this ends up in front of a regulator. Do you have someone external you trust? Not yet. Then get one by tomorrow morning. I'll give you 3 names before I go to bed tonight. A pause. And Margot, whatever you're planning for that gala, whatever theatrical little script you've built, and don't think I don't know you well enough to guess there's a script. You have to let this happen in a way that protects the evidence chain. If this ever becomes a criminal or regulatory matter, and I think it might, nobody can be able to say later that you tampered with anything, that you triggered this out of personal spite, that you timed it for maximum humiliation instead of maximum legal defensibility. It's automated, I told her. I'm not going to be anywhere near it when it fires. It's not me pulling a trigger. It's the system doing exactly what it's designed to do the second the conditions I documented months ago are met, entirely independent of anyone's personal feelings on the matter. There was a long pause on the line, and then, quietly, almost admiringly, "That's actually very smart. That's genuinely, annoyingly smart, Margot. You built yourself an alibi 8 months before you knew you'd need one." "I built myself a smoke detector," I said. "I just happened to build it in a house I suspected, eventually, somebody was going to try to burn down." Speaking of Diane, I should tell you about the note. It arrived Thursday evening. An internal message through a system so obscure most of the company doesn't know it exists. A secure legal and compliance channel we technically maintain for whistleblower reports, one I happen to be the primary administrator of. It had no subject line. It read, in its entirety, "I've seen the vendor spend on Cobalt Bridge. I've also seen the deck for Friday. An early draft got forwarded to finance by mistake for expense approval. I don't know exactly what you know, Margot, but I suspect it's more than they think. I'll be in the room Friday. Do what you do. D.O." I read it twice. Then I sat back and, for the first time all week, actually smiled without the accompanying urge to commit light arson. The dinosaur, it turned out, had an ally in the one person in that building whose word could not be dismissed, deflected, or PR managed away. She hadn't reached out to save me. Diane Okafor did not strike me from her 3-line message alone as a woman inclined to save anyone. She'd reached out because she recognized from the outside exactly the shape of what was happening, and because incoming CFOs do not appreciate discovering a hidden authentication bypass and a shell company slush fund 3 weeks after they've told the board a funding round is clean. We were, without either of us saying it outright, about to become each other's proof. I typed back a short reply, careful, deliberately vague in case the message was ever pulled into a legal record later and needed to withstand scrutiny on its own. Understood. I'll have documentation ready. Thank you for the visibility. Then, because some part of me couldn't resist it, I added one more line before I hit send. I think you'll find Friday very informative. Her reply came back within 4 minutes, a single line. Looking forward to it. D. I didn't know Diane Okafor well yet. Not really. Not beyond her reputation and a handful of terse, efficient emails about budget approvals since she'd joined a month earlier. But I found myself, oddly, trusting that 4-minute response time more than I'd trusted almost anything else that entire week. People who are hiding something take longer to answer messages like that. People who are simply, calmly waiting for the truth to catch up with everyone else usually don't. Friday, Gala Day. I want to take a second here because I know some of you are new to this particular corner of the internet, and you're wondering what a corporate compliance officer's version of a battle plan actually looks like. It does not involve a katana. It does not involve a dramatic slow-motion walk through a parking garage while a rock song plays. It involves, in my case, 3 energy drinks I will publicly deny ever drinking, a spreadsheet, and a piece of automation script I named, with all the subtlety of a woman who has stopped caring what anyone thinks of her sense of humor, Justice.exe. Here's how it worked. I built a conditional trigger tied to the Sentinel logging system, set to activate automatically the moment a specific set of conditions were met inside our internal presentation software during the gala's live stream to the ballroom's main screen. If the deck titled Streamlining Legacy Overhead was opened on the presentation account, and if it contained specific flagged phrases I'd already identified from my earlier read of the file, legacy personnel, my own redacted name, compliance hold rate, efficiency mismatch, the script would fire automatically. No human hand required, the moment those slides hit the projector. I would not need to be in the room. I would not need to stand up and dramatically object like some kind of courtroom movie. The system itself, the one I had spent years quietly building into the bones of this company, precisely because I knew, deep down, that someday exactly this kind of night would come, would simply wake up and do its job. The trigger, once it fired, would do 3 things simultaneously. First, it would compile the full evidence package, the spoofed logins, the forged documents, the shell company records, the vulnerability cover-up thread, into a single encrypted file, and immediately email it to a fixed distribution list. Our outside legal counsel, our HR director, our external auditing firm, and Diane Okafor personally. Second, it would freeze the live account credentials of anyone flagged in the evidence, locking Preston and, if he was foolish enough to touch anything that night, Dex, out of any further system access, immediately and irreversibly, until the fraud flag was manually cleared by someone at board level. And third, this part I'm not going to pretend wasn't at least a little bit for my own personal enjoyment, it would override the ballroom's projector feed and replace whatever was on screen with a message. Nothing dramatic, nothing with my name on it, nothing that would humiliate the company in front of the caterers and the interns. Just plain, white, Courier New text on a black background. The same font the terminal uses, because I wanted it to look like the machine itself was speaking. I tested it 4 times in an empty conference room Friday afternoon before I trusted it, using a dummy account and a decoy file, checking every single time that the encrypted payload actually landed intact in the test inbox, that the lockout genuinely held under a simulated override attempt, that the projector override script correctly detected the specific presentation software the ballroom's AV vendor was using, rather than assuming it matched our office setup. I am, again, extremely risk-averse, and I had absolutely no intention of standing in front of a board 6 weeks later trying to explain why my elaborate justice machine had instead frozen the caterer's card reader, or worse, done nothing at all, and let Preston walk away clean because of a version mismatch in a piece of conference room software. Between the second and third test, I got a call back from Priya with the 3 names she'd promised, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, I was on the phone with an outside attorney named Howard Feldstein, a soft-voiced man in his 60s who specialized in exactly this flavor of corporate catastrophe. I walked him through the whole thing, start to finish. The Slack message, the spoofed timestamp, the forged signature, the shell company, and finally, my voice going a little tighter than I intended on this part, the vulnerability and the buried ticket. There was a long pause on his end when I finished, long enough that I actually checked to see if the call had dropped. "Miss Calloway," he finally said, with the weary calm of a man who has heard every version of this story before and is no longer surprised by any of them. "I've been doing this work for 31 years, and I want you to understand something. Most people who find what you found do one of two things. They either sit on it, quietly, terrified, hoping someone else notices it first so they don't have to be the one who blows up their own career reporting it. Or they panic and go straight to the press, or straight to a regulator without building a proper record first, and end up undermining their own credibility in the process. You built an automated, time-stamped, independently verifiable evidence trail and a legally defensible trigger mechanism before you told a single outside party. That is, in my professional experience, exceptionally rare." "Is that good or bad?" I asked, only half joking. "It's very good, professionally," he said, and I could hear something that might have been a smile in his voice. "Personally, I imagine it's been an extremely long couple of weeks for you, and I'd encourage you not to mistake being competent under pressure for being fine. Those are different things. But procedurally, yes, it's very good." He paused. "I want you to do exactly what you've planned Friday night. Document every single step of it in writing before it happens. What conditions trigger the script, what it does, who receives what, in what order. And call me the second it's over, not the next morning, the second it's over, even if it's midnight." I appreciated, more than I expected to, being treated like a professional handling a serious matter competently, instead of a hysterical woman who'd stumbled into something over her head. It had been a long week of being underestimated by people considerably less qualified than Howard Feldstein. By 6, the fourth test had run clean, start to finish, exactly as designed, and I finally let myself exhale. I closed my laptop, went home, fed Gerald his insulin on schedule, standing in my kitchen in yesterday's cardigan, while my diabetic cat regarded the entire operation with the profound indifference of an animal who has never once, in his entire life, cared whether his human's career survived the week. Then I put on the one good dress I own that doesn't need dry cleaning, a deep green thing that makes me feel less like a compliance officer and more like a woman who is about to attend her own coronation. I did not, in the end, go to the gala. This surprised even me a little, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt right. I did not want to be standing in that ballroom when the projector went black. I did not want to give Preston Voss the satisfaction of watching my face for a reaction, of being able to say later that I'd made a scene, that I'd been emotional, that I'd somehow proven their legacy dinosaur narrative correct in the exact moment I was disproving it. I wanted to be at home, in sweatpants, with a glass of wine and a diabetic cat asleep on my feet, watching the entire thing happen through server logs, the way God presumably watches most of Twitter. The gala started at 7. I know this because our internal Slack channel, the general company-wide one that I am absolutely not supposed to have admin visibility into, but come on, I built half this infrastructure, lit up around 6:45 with photos of the ballroom, twinkle lights, an ice sculpture for some reason of our company logo slowly weeping onto a linen tablecloth, a chocolate fountain that 3 separate people had already gotten their tie into by 7:15. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked like people who had no idea what was coming. At 8:11, the Slack channel showed a photo of Preston at the podium, mid-toast, champagne glass raised, captioned by someone, "Here we go, recognition segment time," with 3 party emojis. I poured myself a glass of wine. Gerald climbed into my lap, sensed correctly that something significant was happening, and settled in for the show. At 8:19, according to the server logs I was watching scroll in real time on my second monitor, the presentation account opened the file. Streamlining Legacy Overhead, a path forward for Q4. I watched the Sentinel's condition scanner light up green as it parsed the slide content in the background. Legacy personnel detected. Elizabeth. No, sorry. My own name. Redacted for the log. Detected. Compliance hold rate. Detected. Efficiency mismatch. Detected. Trigger condition met. Executing justice. EXE. I watched the server logs from my kitchen table, wine glass sweating a small ring onto the wood, and felt my own pulse pick up despite every ounce of preparation, despite 4 successful tests, despite Howard Feldstein's calm assurance that I'd built something legally sound. There is a very specific kind of nervousness that survives even the most thorough planning. The nervousness of watching something you built entirely alone finally meet the real world for the first time, live, with real consequences and no way to pause it once it starts. I had spent 8 months building the Sentinel in stolen Friday afternoons, never once expecting to actually need it for something this large. Now it was about to run, unsupervised, in front of 400 people, and there was nothing left for me to do but watch. It happened in under a second, faster than a human synapse could fire. The script grabbed the payload, the full zipped evidence file, and fired it out to 4 inboxes at once: legal, HR, our external auditors, and Diane Okafor. Then, before I'd even finished processing that the emails were sent, it reached into the presentation feed and did exactly what I'd built it to do. I know this because the server logs told me, blow by blow, and because I have since had it confirmed, in exhausting, glorious detail, by 3 separate people who were actually in that room. Preston was mid-sentence, apparently something about honoring the contributions of our legacy team members as we move into an exciting new chapter. A sentence I have to assume he thought sounded gracious and instead sounded, to everyone now holding a phone showing them the group chat, like a man reading his own indictment out loud. He clicked his little presentation remote. Nothing happened. He clicked it again. The projector screen went, very simply, black. "Technical difficulties, folks," he said. And someone in the room actually laughed because the timing, God bless it, was genuinely funny even to people who had no idea why. Then the text appeared. White. Courier new. Plain, unadorned, patient. System audit triggered. Unauthorized data manipulation detected. Report sent to legal, compliance, external audit, and office of the CFO. Please stand by. 8:22 p.m. According to the Slack channel, which, again, exists specifically so I could watch this happen live, thank you for the transparency, everyone, there was a solid 10 seconds of dead silence in that ballroom before the typing indicator started flooding the group chat. What is happening? Did the system crash? Oh my God, look at Preston's face. Someone is going to have to explain this to Diane Okafor right now, and I do not envy them. I took a slow sip of wine. It tasted, I am not exaggerating, like victory. Like blood and grapes. If blood and grapes had spent 14 years being underestimated by men in vests. On the server side, I watched the login attempt start rolling in almost immediately. Frantic little failures stacking up in the console like popcorn kernels going off. User, Preston Voss, attempting force close application. Access denied. User, Preston Voss, attempting server reboot. Access denied. Admin lockout in effect. He was mashing buttons. I could picture it perfectly, the vest getting tighter by the minute, sweat starting to bead at his hairline under the ballroom lights, that easy, shark-like confidence curdling in real time into something closer to panic. Somewhere in that room, a machine he'd tried to weaponize against me had woken up and grabbed him by the throat instead, and there was nothing he could do about it. Because he had never once bothered to learn how the thing actually worked. He'd always assumed I was the dinosaur. Dinosaurs, in case nobody's mentioned this to Preston, were the apex predator on this planet for roughly 165 million years. We do not go extinct quietly, and we absolutely do not apologize for it. Login attempt, Dex Halloran, growth account, attempting root access. Rejected, insufficient privileges. I have to imagine Dex, sweating straight through whatever ironic novelty sweater he'd chosen for the occasion, frantically DMing our on-call IT engineer, who, according to the logs, replied with something to the effect of, "Not it, man. This is locked by the compliance demon. Only Margot or the CFO have override on this." I pulled up the hashtag #ItSupport channel, which I am also technically not supposed to have visibility into, and which was, by that point, an absolute masterpiece of chaos. Dex Halloran. System frozen. Need bypass codes. ASAP. On-call engineer. It's locked under a level 1 compliance hold. I can't touch it. Only Margot Calloway or a board-level exec can clear it. Dex Halloran. She's not answering her phone. Dex Halloran. Where is Margot? Random employee, not even on this thread somehow. Guys, is the party over? My Uber is outside. On-call engineer. I'm going to be honest with everyone in this channel. I don't think the party is the priority right now. I read that exchange 4 times, laughing so hard I had to set my wine glass down before I spilled it entirely. Where is Margot? I was right there, Dex. I had been right there the entire time, in every log, every timestamp, every line of code that was currently making his Friday night considerably worse than he'd planned. I was in the wires. I was everywhere he'd never once thought to look. Compliance demon. I'm keeping that one. That's going on a mug. Priya, I should mention, was actually in that ballroom. She'd RSVP'd weeks earlier, long before any of this started, and by the time Thursday night rolled around, we'd agreed it would look strange for her to suddenly cancel, and frankly, we both agreed she'd want a front row seat to the single most satisfying professional moment either of us was ever likely to witness. She'd been texting me all evening, a low, running commentary that I was reading on my second phone, the one I keep specifically for things I don't want showing up on any company-issued device. Priya, 8:03 p.m. Table 6 is thriving. Chelsea just told me my centerpiece was so on brand for legal. I don't know what that means, and I'm scared to ask. Priya, 8:14 p.m. Preston is at the podium. He just used the word synergy unironically. I felt that in my teeth. Priya, 8:19 p.m. Wait. Priya, 8:19 p.m. Wait! Priya, 8:20 p.m. The screen just went black. Margot, what did you do? Priya, 8:21 p.m. Oh my God, it's typing something. Everyone is standing up. Diane hasn't moved a single muscle. She is just staring at the screen like she's reading a menu. Priya, 8:23 p.m. I need you to know I am doing the performance of my life right now, pretending I have no idea what's happening. Priya, 8:24 p.m. Diane just pulled out her phone. She is not smiling, but her jaw did a thing. I've seen that thing before in a deposition. That's her tell. I typed back a single word. Good. And set the phone face down on the coffee table because I needed both hands free for my actual laptop, where the real story was unfolding in a language considerably less colorful than Priya's texts, but, in its own way, just as satisfying. Priya kept texting anyway, because apparently nothing, not even a live corporate meltdown, could fully override her instinct to narrate. Priya, 8:27 p.m. Preston is trying to physically unplug the projector cable. Margot, he is under the table trying to unplug a projector cable in a suit that cost more than my rent. Priya, 8:29 p.m. Someone from catering just walked past him like this is a completely normal thing that happens at every corporate holiday party. Priya, 8:30 p.m. Dex is on his phone, I think texting IT. He keeps saying compliance demon out loud like it's a technical term. I am screenshotting everything for legal purposes, and also for my own personal enjoyment. These are not mutually exclusive, Priya. 8:33 p.m. Diane is back. She did not leave the building. She was in the lobby on the phone with someone, and now she's walking back toward the ballroom with a face I can only describe as a woman who has just been handed exactly the ammunition she needed and is trying very hard not to look thrilled about it in public. Reading that last text, I laughed out loud, alone in my apartment, hard enough that Gerald startled awake from his spot on the arm of the couch and gave me a look of profound feline betrayal before resettling 3 inches further away, a clear statement of boundaries. At 8:31, the Slack channel showed a photo, blurry, clearly taken in a panic under a table, of Diane Okafor standing up from her seat at the head table, phone already in hand, face unreadable, walking calmly toward the exit with our general counsel half a step behind her. Someone captioned it, "She looks pissed," which, having since spoken to Diane myself, I can tell you was an interesting read on a woman who was, in reality, extremely satisfied and doing an excellent job of not showing it in front of 400 people. At 8:37, a second attempt appeared in the logs. System override request initiated. Source: Ballroom Admin Console. They were trying for a hard reset, the corporate equivalent of trying to unplug a smoke detector because you don't like what it's telling you. But here's the beautiful part, the part I'd built in specifically for a night like this one. Any hard reset on a system flagged under an active Level 1 compliance hold requires dual-factor authorization from either a board member or a C-suite executive, which meant that, in order to make the screen stop accusing him of fraud, Preston Voss was going to have to walk up to the one person in that ballroom he had been most desperate to impress, and personally ask her for the code to hide the evidence from her. I laughed out loud, alone, in my apartment, loud enough that Gerald startled and knocked my wine glass half an inch across the coffee table. Go ahead, Preston. Ask her. At 8:42, my own phone lit up. Caller ID, Preston Voss, work cell. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. There's a very specific kind of pleasure in letting a phone ring exactly long enough for the person on the other end to fully understand that you are choosing, deliberately, second by second, not to pick up. It went to voicemail. He called again immediately. I let it ring twice more this time, took another slow sip of wine, and answered. Hello, I said, breezy, unbothered, the exact tone you'd use for a telemarketer you were mildly curious about. Margot, where the hell are you? His voice had climbed an entire octave since the last time I'd heard it. In the background, I could hear muffled voices, the clink of abandoned silverware, the particular tense murmur of a room that has realized it's watching something it wasn't supposed to see. "I'm home, Preston. It's Friday. I didn't want to crowd your recognition segment." "Fix it. The system's glitched. It's throwing some kind of error. Diane's asking questions. You need to log in and kill this right now, or I swear to God, Margot, you are done. You're fired. Effective immediately." I let that sit in the air for a second, savoring the sheer, magnificent audacity of a man calling from the wreckage of his own scheme to fire the person whose job it had always, exclusively, been to catch him. "It's not a glitch, Preston." "What? What are you talking about? Just clear the screen." "Did you check your email?" "I don't have time for email. I'm in the middle of a presentation." "You should probably make time. Specifically the one from the audit system. It explains why your screen is locked." There was a pause, a long one. I could hear him fumbling with something, a phone, a clicker, maybe both. "What did you do?" he said, and the voice underneath the anger had shifted entirely, gone thin and unsteady, the sound of a man realizing the floor he's standing on isn't actually floor. "I didn't do anything, Preston. The system did. It flagged unauthorized modification of production data, specifically a set of backdated compliance forms and a set of invoices routed to a shell company called Cobalt Bridge Advisors, registered, if I recall, to a Renata Voss." The silence that followed was long enough and heavy enough that I genuinely wondered if the call had dropped. "You hacked me," he finally said, low, almost a whisper. "That's illegal. I will have you arrested." "I didn't hack you," I said, leaning back in my chair, watching Gerald resettle himself in my lap like he, too, found this deeply satisfying. "I audited you. It's literally my job. You triggered the audit yourself the moment you tried to present forged evidence in front of the incoming CFO. "Margot, listen." His voice cracked, actually cracked, right down the middle. "Bargaining. Textbook. We can fix this. It was just a small thing. We were moving some money around. It's not what it looks like. Just clear the screen. I'll tell Diane it was a system error. I'll get you that promotion you've been asking for. I swear." "I never asked you for a promotion, Preston. I asked you, in writing, in September, to complete your compliance training instead of building a shell company with your sister." I let that sit for a second. "You had 8 weeks to do the easy thing. You chose the felony instead." You don't understand the full picture. There's context you don't have." "I have the context, Preston. I have an entire zip file of context, currently sitting in 5 different inboxes, including your own general counsel's. Would you like me to read you the invoice descriptions? Strategic Alignment Services. I've always wondered what that actually meant. Enlighten me." He didn't answer that one. I could hear him breathing, fast and shallow, the particular sound of a man doing math in his head and not liking any of the numbers he was getting. "Why?" he finally said, quieter now, almost genuinely curious underneath the panic. "Why would you build something like this? Nobody asked you to. Nobody even knew you were doing it." It was, oddly, the first honest question he'd asked me all night, and I actually thought about it for a second before I answered. "Because I got tired of being the only person in this building whose word wasn't automatically believed over a man in a nicer vest," I said. "I got tired of writing incident reports nobody read until it was too late, and then getting blamed for the thing I'd warned everyone about in writing 6 months earlier. I built something that doesn't care whose vest is nicer. It just tells the truth. That was always going to be a problem for someone eventually. I just didn't know it would be you specifically until about 11 days ago. I looked down at my own hands. Unpolished nails, no rings. The hands of a woman who had spent 14 years building exactly this trap, one boring Friday afternoon at a time. It's too late, Preston. It's not. Just type in the override code. I can't. Why not? Because of who signed the audit log, I said. Do you see the signature line at the bottom of your lock screen? I don't care about the signature, Margot. Just fix it. Look at it anyway. I heard him shuffle closer to whatever screen was near him, breath hitching audibly through the phone. The signature line, I happened to know, did not say Margot Calloway Admin. It read, Final approval, compliance oversight, external copy sent to Board of Directors. You see? I said softly. Once the flagged amount crosses a certain threshold, the system doesn't just notify me. It notifies the audit committee directly, outside counsel. It's automatic. I can't stop it now, even if I wanted to. Neither can you. Neither, frankly, can Diane. You ruined me, he whispered. And it did genuinely sound, for the first time all night, like he might be crying. No, Preston, I said, reaching for the button to end the call. You tried to frame the woman who built the jail. You just locked yourself inside it. I hung up. I did not block the number. Part of me wanted to see if he'd call back. He didn't. My other phone buzzed almost immediately, Priya's name lighting up the screen. And this time, she wasn't texting. She was calling. I picked up to the unmistakable sound of a hotel ballroom in the process of quietly, catastrophically falling apart in the background. Raised voices, someone's heel on marble, a saxophonist who had apparently decided the professional thing to do was simply keep playing. You beautiful, terrifying woman, Priya said, breathless, and I could hear her walking fast, probably toward the lobby, putting distance between herself and whatever was happening at table 6. I just watched Marcus Sterling. Sorry, Diane, I keep doing that. I watched Diane Okafor take Preston's badge out of his own hand in front of 40 people and hand it directly to security like she was passing him a coat check ticket. He tried to say something about a misunderstanding, and she said, and I'm quoting, "You can explain the misunderstanding to the audit committee on Monday." And then she just walked away. She didn't even raise her voice. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever watched a human being do to another human being while wearing 4-inch heels. Is Chelsea still there? Chelsea left about 6 minutes ago claiming a migraine, which, sure, Chelsea, sure. Dex is sitting alone at his table, eating an entire plate of shrimp cocktail like it's his last meal, which, given how his Monday is about to go, might not be an entirely inaccurate read of the situation. She exhaled, and I heard the ambient noise change. A door, quieter air, probably the lobby. How are you doing? Actually doing, not compliance officer doing. I thought about that for a second, sitting in my kitchen with a cat on my feet and an empty wine glass and a phone that had just stopped ringing after telling a man his entire career was over. Honestly, I feel like I finally exhaled after holding my breath for 8 months and not fully realizing it. Good, Priya said. Sleep. Actually sleep. Not the fake kind where you lie there running through log files in your head. Monday's going to be a very long day, and you're going to want to be sharp for it, because I promise you, this is not close to over. Byrne's name is going to come up. The board is going to have questions that go a lot higher up the org chart than Preston Voss, and you are about to become the single most important witness this company has ever had. Rest while you still get to." She was right, of course. She usually is. I sat there for a long time after that, in the quiet of my kitchen, Gerald purring against my leg, the adrenaline slowly draining out of me and leaving behind something heavier and much more satisfying. The specific, bone-deep exhaustion you feel after you've finally cleared a rot out of your own house. The kind of tired that comes right before genuinely good sleep. I finished my wine. I patted the cat. "Well," I said out loud to nobody, "I guess I have to go into the office Monday." Walking into the office that Monday morning felt a little like walking into a cathedral the day after a bomb went off. The structure was all still standing, load-bearing walls intact, but the stained glass had shattered everywhere, and everyone was speaking in hushed, careful whispers, like too loud a noise might bring the rest of the ceiling down. The holiday decorations were, grimly, still up, which added a very specific note of dark comedy to the whole scene. The tinsel looked less like festive cheer and more like crime scene tape. Someone had left a novelty ugly sweater draped over the back of Dex's chair, and his desk was empty. Not just empty, sanitized. IT security had apparently come in over the weekend and quietly collected the hardware. No laptop, no monitor, just an empty dock and a faint rectangle of dust where his arrogance used to sit. People looked at me as I walked to my office. Nobody waved. Nobody smiled. A junior designer named Owen, who I don't think I'd exchanged more than 4 sentences with in the entire time he'd worked there, actually stood up from his desk as I passed, like I was a judge entering a courtroom, then seemed to realize what he'd done and sat back down very quickly, red to the ears. Someone had left a sticky note on my monitor, unsigned, that just said, "Thank you," in handwriting I didn't recognize and never did identify, and I kept it in my desk drawer for months afterward, tucked next to a stapler I never did get to throw at anyone. They looked at me with a mixture of terror and something close to awe, and I understood, somewhere around my 3rd step onto the floor, that I wasn't the dinosaur anymore. Dinosaurs are relics. What I had apparently become, in the space of one very long weekend, was something closer to a myth. The compliance officer you did not, under any circumstances, want to be on the wrong side of, ever, for any reason, for the rest of your natural career. I want to tell you that felt entirely good, uncomplicated, purely triumphant, and mostly it did. But there was a small, strange undercurrent to it too. A loneliness in being suddenly, universally feared by people who, a week earlier, had simply overlooked me, which is its own kind of quiet grief I wasn't fully prepared for. Being underestimated is exhausting. Being the myth everyone whispers about in the elevator is, it turns out, its own particular flavor of exhausting, just dressed up in considerably nicer clothes. I sat down at my desk. My coffee, someone had actually made fresh, which had never once happened in 14 years. My inbox had that minimum density of a Monday that everyone in the building had been dreading. HR, investigation interview request. Legal, evidence preservation notice. And near the top, simply, Diane Okafor. Please come see me when you're in. Before that, though, I had a 2-hour appointment with our HR director, a genuinely kind woman named Renee Cho, who I liked considerably more than I'd ever had reason to interact with before that morning, and Howard Feldstein, dialed in from his office by speakerphone, his soft, unhurried voice a strange comfort in a small conference room that had, until 11 days earlier, been used almost exclusively for benefits enrollment meetings. They walked me through everything, slowly, methodically, the way you'd expect people to when the eventual outcome might involve depositions instead of performance reviews. What time did you first see the Slack message? Did you take any action to alter, delete, or otherwise modify any system logs before reporting them? Who did you tell and when? Did you have any direct communication with Mr. Voss, Mr. Halloran, or Ms. Cole regarding the contents of the presentation prior to Friday evening? I answered every question plainly, factually, without editorializing, which is a skill 14 years of writing incident reports had trained into me long before I ever needed it for anything this serious. Renee paused at one point, pen hovering over her legal pad, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't expected, something closer to genuine sorrow than procedure. For what it's worth, Margot, I want you to know I had no idea any of this was happening. Preston kept the gala planning entirely within his own team. If I'd seen even a piece of that deck beforehand, I would have shut it down before it ever left a laptop. I believe you, I told her, and I did. Renee had never once, in 6 years of working with her, given me a single reason not to trust her judgment, which put her in a very short list at that company. Howard's voice crackled through the speakerphone. Margot, I want to be direct with you about where this is likely headed, because I think you're owed that clarity rather than corporate vagueness. The forgery and the shell company are, frankly, the easy part. Clear documentary evidence, clear financial trail, clear criminal referral. The vulnerability disclosure issue is going to take considerably longer, and it is going to involve people well beyond this building. Outside auditors, likely regulators, possibly the SEC, depending on what the investigation into Mr. Burns' actions and anyone who directed them ultimately turns up. You should expect to be a central witness in that process for months, not weeks. I'd encourage you to keep your own personal records of everything moving forward, separate from company systems, dated, backed up somewhere outside Halcyon's infrastructure entirely. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, some old habit of politeness refusing to die, even in a conversation about potential federal securities violations. I already do, I said, thinking of the small, personal, entirely outside company external drive sitting in my desk drawer at home, the rubber duck keychain looped through its handle. Some habits, it turns out, you develop long before you know exactly why you'll need them. By the time that meeting ended, it was nearly noon, and I hadn't yet eaten anything besides the fresh coffee someone had, inexplicably, brewed for the entire floor. I took a sip of the last of it, black, no sugar, straightened my cardigan, and walked to Diane's office. Diane Okafor was not what I expected, and I want to be honest, my expectations going in were not exactly generous. The finance team's fear of her had built up an image in my head of someone sharp-edged and cold, the kind of executive who treats her own staff like line items to be optimized. What I found instead was a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair, reading glasses pushed up into it, sitting behind a desk that was almost entirely bare except for one stack of printed papers. My papers, the logs, the invoices, the audit trail, printed out and covered in handwritten annotations in tight, precise blue ink. She looked up when I knocked, didn't smile, didn't scowl either, just gestured to the chair across from her. Margot, she said. Her voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. Close the door. I sat. I didn't fidget. I had, for once in my professional life, absolutely nothing to hide. I spent the weekend with General Counsel, she said, tapping the stack of papers, and with our external auditors. This is thorough. I try to be thorough. You built the entire system yourself. The Sentinel. She said the name the way you'd say the title of a book you genuinely enjoyed. That's not a small project. That's a full internal audit architecture running quietly in production for months that nobody signed off on. It was a pilot, I admitted. I was planning to bring it forward officially next quarter as a fraud prevention proposal. She leaned back, folding her reading glasses closed. Well, consider it launched. It certainly worked. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that felt less like an evaluation and more like recalibration, a woman quietly revising an assumption in real time. Preston is terminated for cause, effective this morning. There will very likely be criminal referral on the shell company and the forged compliance documentation. That's a fraud matter now, not an HR one. Dex has been suspended, pending investigation into how much he knew versus how much he was simply careless enough to enable. Chelsea is being interviewed today. She paused. And Arthur Byrne resigned this morning, before he could be asked to. I nodded slowly. The vulnerability, Diane confirmed, and something tightened almost imperceptibly around her eyes. That thread you flagged, between Byrne and Voss, I want you to understand what that actually was, Margot, because I don't think even you fully clocked the size of it in the middle of everything else. That authentication bypass had been live and exploitable for 4 months. Our due diligence review for the Series D was scheduled to start Monday, today. If that flaw had surfaced during the investor security audit instead of ours, we would not have just lost the round. We would very likely be looking at a securities fraud investigation of our own, given how confidently our CEO signed off on the security representations in the term sheet. That last sentence landed harder than I expected. Does he know? The CEO? Diane held my gaze for a second longer than was entirely comfortable. That's an open question, she said, carefully, in the exact tone of a woman choosing every word like she was diffusing something. Byrne's resignation letter implies he acted alone in bearing the ticket, to protect the round. I don't fully believe that, and I don't think you do either. But that is now a matter for outside counsel and, likely, the audit committee, not for this conversation. What I can tell you is that the round has been paused, not killed, while the flaw is properly patched and disclosed, which is, frankly, the outcome that should have happened in September if 2 men hadn't decided your job was an inconvenience instead of a safeguard. How is the board handling it? I asked. This isn't the kind of thing that stays contained to one floor. Diane leaned forward slightly, forearms on the desk, and for the first time in the conversation, her voice dropped into something quieter, more careful. The register of a woman choosing to trust me with something before she was technically required to. The board is split into 2 very predictable camps, if I'm honest with you. One camp wants this handled as quietly and as fast as possible. Settle whatever needs settling, patch the vulnerability, keep the round moving. Treat Preston as an isolated bad actor, and move on before the story has time to attach itself to the company's name in the press. The other camp, which I happen to sit in, wants a full independent review, no matter how long it takes or how uncomfortable it gets. Because a company that quietly handles its own fraud in-house every time it happens is not actually a company that's fixed anything. It's just a company that's gotten better at hiding the body. And which camp is winning? Right now, mine. Because I walked into that boardroom Saturday morning with your evidence package and told them in fairly plain terms that if we handled this quietly and it ever came out that we had, and things like this always eventually come out, Margot, always, we would lose considerably more than a funding round. We'd lose the ability to ever again tell an investor, a regulator, or a customer that our internal controls actually mean anything. She paused. I will tell you honestly, because I think you've earned honesty at this point and not corporate hedging. I don't yet know exactly how far this goes. I don't know if Byrne acted alone, protecting himself in Preston, or whether someone above both of them quietly signed off on looking the other way. I intend to find out. It may take months. I need you to be patient through that. And I need you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing this entire time, which is documenting everything, flagging everything, and refusing to let anyone above you talk you into looking away from something because it's inconvenient for the timeline. That's the job, I said. That's always been the job. It's just usually a much smaller job than this. Not anymore, Diane said. And there was something almost like an apology underneath it. An acknowledgement that she was handing me a much heavier version of the role than the one I'd signed up for 14 years earlier. I need to know you're willing to carry that. I built a machine specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of thing, I said. I think it's a little late to ask if I'm willing. That got the real smile again, quick and genuine. Fair enough. She let that sit for a moment, then slid the folder across the desk toward me. I don't need a senior director of risk and fraud prevention anymore, Margot. I need a chief risk officer, reporting directly to me and to the audit committee. No Preston in the chain. No one standing between you and the board when you find something like this again. I looked down at the folder. It was, unmistakably, a promotion. The kind that comes with a title people actually respect at dinner parties, and a salary that would finally, genuinely, make a dent in my mortgage. One condition, I said. Diane raised an eyebrow, the first real flicker of something like amusement crossing her face all morning. I want budget to formalize the Sentinel, I said. Officially, approved, documented, audited by an outside firm, and mandatory across every department, sales, engineering, growth, all of it. No more hidden scripts running quietly in the background because I was the only one paranoid enough to think we needed one. Transparency has to be the actual policy here, not just the word on the lobby wall. Diane's mouth curved into something that was, unmistakably, a real smile. Done, she said. Welcome to the new era, Chief Risk Officer. We shook hands. Hers was solid, unhurried, exactly the handshake you'd expect from a woman who had apparently been quietly watching this entire company for weeks before anyone even knew to be afraid of her. I walked out of her office and the floor was almost eerily quiet. I passed the fishbowl conference room where Preston used to hold court, tinsel still limply hanging off one corner of the glass. It was just an empty room now, glass and chairs and a whiteboard nobody had bothered to erase. I wasn't happy, exactly. Happiness is a luxury reserved for people who don't know how the sausage actually gets made in a building like this one. But I was, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, satisfied. The ledger was balanced. The error had been corrected. There was, however, one last thing. The investigation dragged on for weeks after that, though the outcome, in the broad strokes, was never really in doubt. Preston was formally charged in connection with the wire fraud tied to the shell company, and the last I heard, his sister's marketing/wedding photography LLC had become a very unpleasant topic of conversation at family holidays going forward, which, honestly, feels appropriate. Dex was let go without criminal charges. The investigation concluded he'd been careless and complicit enough to lose his job, but hadn't known about the fraud or the security cover-up specifically. Which tracks, since Dex has never in his life demonstrated the attention span required to actually understand a shell company. Chelsea resigned before HR could finish her interview, which most of us read as its own kind of confession. Arthur Burns' situation, last I heard, is still moving quietly through outside counsel, and I suspect it will take considerably longer than anyone wants it to before we find out exactly how far up that particular decision actually went. Some doors, I've learned, take longer to open than others, and some of them, frankly, are better opened slowly, with a lawyer standing next to you the whole time. The company culture, for what it's worth, genuinely shifted. Move fast and break things quietly disappeared from the all-hands slide decks, replaced with something considerably less catchy, but a great deal more honest. Move carefully, document everything, and do not, under any circumstances, make the chief risk officer find out about it from a server log instead of from you directly. But I kept one souvenir for myself. I want to tell you about it because I think it's the part of this whole story that actually taught me something, underneath all the satisfaction of watching a man's career collapse live on a hotel projector screen. In the final compiled audit report, the one that eventually went to the board, to outside counsel, to the auditors, the whole official record, there was a section I never fully disclosed, not even to Diane. The Sentinel, it turns out, didn't just log keystrokes and timestamps and Bluetooth handshakes. During flagged high-risk events, on devices where I'd enabled the diagnostic capture, it also briefly activated the built-in microphone to record 30 seconds of ambient audio, purely as contextual metadata, purely, originally, so I'd have a record of whether an approval had happened in a quiet office or a crowded meeting room. A small, boring engineering decision I'd made 8 months ago and mostly forgotten about. Preston's laptop had triggered that capture the night of the gala, during the exact minute he'd overridden his own account trying to force a reboot. I sat in my new corner office weeks later with a door that actually locked and a view of the skyline instead of a supply closet, and I pulled the audio file up out of pure, undiluted curiosity. Kyle Voice Capture, the system had auto-labeled it, back before I'd renamed the flagged accounts, then corrected to Voss Voice Capture. I put on my headphones. It was scratchy, muffled by fabric, clearly recorded from inside a jacket pocket, but clear enough. Preston, talking low and fast, not to me, not to Dex, to a woman. Not his wife, whose name I happen to know from the company directory, because I know everyone's name. It's basically my entire personality at this point. Don't worry, babe. Once this whole thing dies down, the bonus is still coming. We just have to ride it out, he was saying, breathless, half laughing in that particular way men laugh when they think they've already won. She's so old school. She has no idea what's actually happening here. We're not even doing anything wrong. We're just speeding things up a little. And then a small laugh back, familiar, unmistakable, even through the muffled recording. Chelsea's laugh. You're so bad, she said. I'm the future, Chels, he said. She's the past. I stopped the playback. The future, as it turned out, was currently facing a fraud investigation and a very awkward family Thanksgiving. The past was sitting in a corner office drinking coffee, deciding which department's onboarding process needed tightening next. I didn't send that file to the board. I didn't need to. It wasn't relevant to the fraud case, and frankly, whatever was or wasn't happening between Preston and Chelsea on company time was, at that point, the least interesting thing either of them had done. I kept it for exactly one reason, and it wasn't revenge, or not only revenge. It was a reminder. A small, private, permanent reminder that arrogance is, in the end, the single most predictable vulnerability there is. They thought I was a dinosaur, slow, obsolete, easy to write off. They forgot that dinosaurs ruled this planet for 165 million years, and that a T-Rex has never once, in the entire fossil record, apologized for eating the smaller, faster, dumber thing that wandered too close. I deleted the file. Gone. Digital dust, the same as everything else I'd ever put in that system that had outlived its purpose. Let me jump forward for a second because I think you deserve the full picture, not just the satisfying part where the villain's voice cracks on a phone call. That part is fun to tell, but it's not actually the end of the story, and I promised you a real ending, not just a cliffhanger dressed up as one. 3 months later, in early spring, I sat in my first full board meeting as Chief Risk Officer in a conference room on the top floor I'd been in maybe 4 times total in 14 years, presenting a formal report on the remediation of the Payments API vulnerability, the closure of the Cobalt Bridge Shell Company, and the finalized, board-approved rollout of what the company now officially calls the Sentinel Compliance Framework, mandatory across every department, audited quarterly by an outside firm, with escalation paths that go directly to the audit committee and bypass any single executive's ability to quietly bury a ticket ever again. Walt, our founder, sat at the end of the table, considerably grayer than I remembered him being even 6 months earlier, and did not make eye contact with me for most of the meeting, which told me almost everything I needed to know about how deep Howard Feldstein's earlier warning had actually gone. I'm not going to pretend I know the full resolution of the burn situation, because as of the writing of this, I genuinely don't. Not the parts that matter most. What I can tell you is that the investigation into how far up the decision to bury that vulnerability actually traveled is still, as far as I understand it, active, handled entirely by outside counsel and an independent committee of 2 board members with no operational ties to the executive team, specifically so nobody currently working in that building, including me, has any influence over where it lands. I've been interviewed twice more since that first Monday, always with Howard present, always thorough, always careful. I've learned to be patient with processes like this in a way I genuinely wasn't before all of this happened. Some doors really do take longer to open than you'd like, and pushing on them before they're ready doesn't open them any faster. It just leaves fingerprints. The Series D round did eventually close, 6 weeks later than originally planned, at a slightly lower valuation than the original term sheet, with a fully disclosed and fully patched security history that our new investors' due diligence team went over with what I can only describe as forensic delight, given that most of the work had already been done for them by the time they arrived. One of their partners, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Corinne, pulled me aside after the closing dinner and said, with what I choose to believe was genuine respect rather than pity, "You're the reason we're still doing this deal at all, you know. Most companies bury this stuff until it blows up in a courtroom. You made us trust the number instead of just trust the pitch." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said thank you and went home and told Gerald about it in great detail because he is, at this point, the only living creature who has heard the entire unabridged version of this story roughly 40 separate times and has never once complained. Preston's case moved through the system slower than any of us expected, the way these things apparently always do. He was formally charged with wire fraud in connection with the Shell Company by early February, and the last update I got, secondhand, through Priya, who still occasionally gets calls from opposing counsel for document requests, was that he'd taken a plea deal involving restitution and a suspended sentence on the condition of full cooperation with the ongoing investigation into the vulnerability cover-up, which means, delightfully, that the man who once tried to frame me for his own crimes is now, by legal obligation, actively helping build the case against himself and, potentially, against whoever above him signed off on burying that ticket. I did not shed a single tear over that particular irony. I may have poured a slightly larger glass of wine than usual the night I heard about it. Dex, last I checked his very public LinkedIn, has rebranded himself as an independent growth consultant, which, if you know anything about how that phrase usually gets used, tells you almost everything you need to know about how his job search has been going. Chelsea resigned 2 days after the gala and, according to the same LinkedIn grapevine, now works in employee wellness at a different startup, a sentence I have chosen not to have any further feelings about. And me? I hired a team. 4 people, all of them considerably younger than me, all of them, refreshingly, hired specifically because they asked hard questions in their interviews instead of promising me they'd never slow anything down. My new deputy, a sharp 29-year-old named Farah, who used to work in bank examination before she got tired of regulators moving slower than the fraud they were chasing, sits 2 doors down in what used to be Preston's office and has already, in 3 months, caught 2 separate vendor onboarding shortcuts that would have made me very unhappy a year ago. I let her run point on both. She handled them better than I would have at her age, honestly. And there is a very specific, very unglamorous kind of pride in watching someone younger than you do your old job better than you remember doing it yourself. Priya made partner track this spring, a promotion I like to believe I had at least a small, indirect hand in, given how much of the biggest case of her career so far ran directly through my office. We still have lunch every Wednesday. We still complain about the coffee, which has, somehow, gotten worse since the good machine broke and nobody's replaced it. An oversight I have chosen to interpret as the last remaining piece of authentic company culture left standing. But that's getting ahead of myself again. Let me go back to that first quiet evening in my new corner office, weeks after the gala, long before any board meetings or closing dinners, back when all I actually knew for certain was that the machine had worked exactly the way I'd built it to, and that I had one last piece of unfinished business sitting on a hard drive that nobody but me would ever know existed. It was almost 6 that evening when I finished. The office had gone quiet, the cleaning crew starting their rounds of floor below. I opened a new browser tab and, because apparently some habits never fully die no matter how many titles you collect, I went to Reddit, opened a new post, and started typing. I overheard my coworkers plan to publicly humiliate me at the company holiday party, so I let the audit logs do the talking instead. I smiled at my own reflection in the dark part of the screen. "You wanted an exposé, Preston," I said out loud, to an empty office, lighting an entirely imaginary, entirely satisfying cigarette in my head. "Congratulations, you're the star of it. Now get off my stage." I hit post. I didn't expect much from it, honestly. I'd posted smaller, vaguer versions of office stories on that same account before, mostly to an audience of maybe a few hundred people who seem to enjoy the same specific flavor of corporate schadenfreude I do. This one, though, moved differently. By the time I checked it again the next morning over coffee, it had climbed to the front page of the subreddit, and the comments had that particular chaotic energy of a story people couldn't quite believe was real. Throwaway_actuary_88. Absolutely not a real story, but I need it to be real, the compliance demon line sent me. Margot Calloway_ITA. Top comment, 4.2K upvotes. The fact that he had to personally ask the CFO for the override code to hide the evidence from the CFO is genuinely the funniest sentence I've read all year. Not your dinosaur. As someone who has also been called resistant to change by a man half my age for the crime of asking, "Is this legal?" I felt this in my soul. Finance_bro_hater. Wait, so did they ever figure out how far up the vulnerability cover-up went? You can't just drop that and not follow up. Proud_dinosaur_energy. T-Rex doesn't apologize for eating the goat is going on a shirt. I will pay money for this shirt. Skeptical_of_Reddit. OP works in compliance and somehow also has time to write like a screenwriter. Sure. Jan, OP. Margot Calloway_ITA. Skeptical of Reddit. I have a cat with diabetes and a lot of repressed rage. It turns out that's a very productive combination. I read the whole thread twice, laughing quietly to myself over coffee, and then, because I genuinely couldn't resist it, I typed one more reply before closing the tab and getting ready for work. Margot Calloway_ITA. To everyone asking if this is real, I'll just say that the names have been changed, some details have been softened for reasons that will make sense if you've ever worked anywhere near a legal department, and the diabetic cat is 100%, unquestionably, completely real. He says hello. He does not care about any of this. Then I closed the laptop, picked up my bag, and drove home, where Gerald was waiting by his food bowl with the specific, unimpressed patience of a cat who has never once cared about anyone's professional victories. And honestly, that's probably for the best. It keeps a person humble, even a dinosaur with a corner office. One more thing, and then I really will let you go. This year's holiday gala happened 3 weeks ago. Same downtown hotel, same ballroom, though Diane mercifully vetoed the ice sculpture this time, on the grounds that watching our company logo slowly melt onto a tablecloth had apparently become an unfortunate visual metaphor nobody needed twice. Farah wore a dress the exact same shade of green as mine, entirely by coincidence, and when she noticed, she just grinned at me across the room and mouthed, "Load-bearing wall," which I choose to believe was a compliment and not, as Priya insists, a very gentle roast. There was no recognition segment this year. There was, instead, a genuinely nice speech from Diane about the values the company had rebuilt itself around over the past 12 months, transparency chief among them, and I sat at a table with Priya and Farah and 2 of my new analysts, eating a slightly better version of the same rubbery chicken we always serve at these things, and felt, for the first time in longer than I want to admit, something close to simple, uncomplicated contentment. Nobody was plotting anything against me at table 6. Nobody's Apple Watch was 3 feet from a workstation approving a fake code push at 3:17 in the morning. It was, by every measure that matters, an extremely boring party. And I want you to understand that after the year I'd had, boring was the single greatest gift that room could have given me. So that's the story. That's how a Growth Hackers group chat typo, one accidental reply all at 4:52 on a Friday afternoon, ended up costing a VP his job, a shell company, a security cover-up, and, as far as I can tell, whatever future he thought he was building with a woman who was very quick to laugh at "she's the past," and, I have to imagine, was considerably less quick to laugh 3 weeks later. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely, for sitting through the entire audit trail with me. If this is your first time here, I tell stories like this one every so often, mostly true, occasionally exaggerated for pacing, always with the names changed enough that nobody's lawyers show up in my comments section. If you enjoyed watching a man's entire empire collapse via a compliance script named justice.exe, do me a favor and hit that follow button. Apparently, telling this story to strangers on the internet is significantly cheaper than therapy and infinitely more satisfying. And if you've got your own story about a Preston or a Kyle or a Dex, or whichever flavor of overconfident office villain you've had the pleasure of outlasting, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, usually with a glass of wine and a diabetic cat judging me quietly from the arm of the couch. A few of you asked me some version of the same handful of questions after I first told this story out loud, so let me knock those out quickly before I go, because I know somebody's going to ask them again in the comments below no matter what I do. Yes, Gerald is fine. Better than fine, actually. His insulin dose got adjusted slightly at his last checkup, and the vet says his numbers are the best they've been in 2 years, which either means the diabetes is genuinely stabilizing, or means he's been quietly stealing bites of Priya's dog's low-sugar treats every Wednesday when she comes over for lunch. And at this point, I've decided I don't want to know which. No, I did not personally show up at the gala after the projector went black. And no, I have never regretted that decision for a single second. I know it might have felt more cinematic to walk in through those doors in my green dress at exactly the right moment. But real satisfaction, in my experience, rarely needs an audience standing right in front of it. I got to watch the whole thing unfold through server logs and one very reliable best friend's live text commentary from my own kitchen in sweatpants with a cat on my lap. And honestly, I wouldn't trade that for a single dramatic hallway entrance. Yes, I still have the audio file's metadata record, even though I deleted the file itself, because deleting a file and deleting the fact that a file once existed and was properly logged are two very different things in a system built by someone who takes chain of custody seriously. Make of that what you will. And no, before anyone asks, I have not personally spoken to Preston since that Friday night phone call, and I don't intend to. Some doors, once you've watched someone try to burn your entire career down through them, are just better left permanently closed, restitution plan or not. Until next time, keep your logs clean, keep your receipts, and never, ever underestimate the woman everyone's already decided to call the dinosaur. We've survived worse than you.